Last week you saw some of the worst CPUs ever made. CPUs that sometimes didn't even actually work, and other times plunged the tech industry into a hegemony of bribery, lies, and abuse. But let's not talk about that anymore. This is the top 7 best CPUs ever made. CPUs that push the boundary, CPUs that empowered the user, CPUs that were just goddamn great, and we are all profiting from their existence right now. But first, let us remember the first commercial CPU, the Intel 4004. It's not on the list of the best CPUs ever made, but it should be mentioned first and foremost because this was the impetus, this was the starting point. With this, Intel went on to create other CPUs like the 8008 and then the 80080, the CPU that was used by the Altair 8800 computer, the one responsible for Microsoft existing. So that's why it's not on the list. That being said, let's get it started with number 7, the Overclocking Kings. There have been quite a few processors over the ages that allow the heavy degree of overclocking, but a few of them truly stand out. And because I didn't want to make this entire list just about overclocking, I put them all in one place. I'm referring to processors like the Duron 600 from the Thunderbird age of AMD, a processor that didn't cost all that much, but with the use of a pencil, you could connect some bridges on it, and you could overclock it from 600 MHz to around 1.2 GHz. That's not a small overclock. Or the Core 2 Duo. Not only did the Core 2 Duo trample the hell out of the Pentium Ds, but you could overclock them by around a gigahertz, making them truly signify exactly how horrible the Pentium D was. And then you have Sandy Bridge, which to this day is a superb architecture, which, thanks to its overclocking headroom that can take it to 5 GHz with proper cooling, still doesn't require an upgrade for most people. And of course, the Phenom 2 X3. Not only was the entire Phenom 2 series basically overclockable to the max, but the Phenom 3 had one disabled core, which, depending on your luck, could be reactivated and it could work absolutely fine. That sort of highlights a difference between AMD and Intel. Intel tended to have more types of CPUs on the market, whereas AMD didn't have as many, so they resorted to binning and removing some functions from some of their CPUs to sell them at a lower cost. And you could sometimes reactivate those missing features and have yourself an amazing bang for your buck. Trust me when I say that you've never overclocked a CPU unless you've used a pencil. Number 6, the Acorn Computer ARM2. Yeah, this is not an x86 processor, let alone one that was used. Well, it was used a lot for PCs, but not recently. The ARM2 is the genesis of the mobile revolution. Even when it was released about a bajillion years ago, the ARM2 had better performance than the Intel 286, and yet it consumed less power. Sure, it was a simpler design and couldn't do some of the things that x86 does, like run x86 code, but the ARM2 stood as the basis for everything that would come, for the use of ARM CPUs in things like the Apple Newton PDA or every smartphone that exists now. We're talking about billions and billions of devices using the technology that was spearheaded by the ARM2, by the Acorn RISC machine. You probably have an ARM CPU around you. If you don't own a smartphone, there is probably one in your computer, or maybe one in your TV, or maybe one in your shoes. Yes, they know where you're walking. And you have to admit, when it comes to efficiency and running at low power, you you really can't beat the ARM CPU. Number 5. The MOS Techonology 6502. This CPU architecture was the basis for what many people see as being the genesis of the computing age, of the gaming age. The Atari 2600 used one of these CPUs. The original Apple used it. The Apple II used it. The NES used it. The Commodore 64 used a variant of it. This thing was everywhere. Absolutely everywhere for almost a decade. And hey, you remember those Tamagotchis from the 90s that vanished? Yeah, same CPU. It's really kind of hard to contest the importance of this CPU. I mean, without it, what would have Wozniak used in the Apple II? I honestly have no idea. Maybe an Intel CPU, and then we would have had backwards compatibility with older Apple II programs, and maybe the NES would have used Intel 2, and everything would have been built on x86, giving Intel complete power over everything and ushering in sooner the dark age of technology. So thank the elder gods that the MOS Techonology 6502 existed. Number 4. The Motorola 68000. Much like the MOS Techonology 6502, this thing was everywhere. It was used in some hipster trash computers like the first Apple Macintosh, which you kind of face it was kind of crap, but this was also used as the basis for the Atari ST, for the Amiga computer system, for some of the first 16-bit computers ever made, though they supported kind of 32-bit as well, because the CPU family did sort of have 32-bit. It's not important. What is important is that this technology was used in a great number of very important and very good quality systems. This was in the Neo Geo, this was in the Sega Genesis, and again sadly in the Apple Macintosh. Number 3. The Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600. What can be said about this fantastic CPU? This basically saved Intel. This was the first quad-core CPU. Commercial one, I mean, for people. This was a powerhouse. A CPU with 4 cores running in tandem, all working at their peak efficiency, with the ability to be overclocked to hell and back if you had enough cooling and a power supply that was powered by the sun itself. And I don't mean solar power, I mean you plugged it into the sun. And of course if you had the cooling capabilities of Sub-Zero. With all that aside, this was a superb CPU, one that is still competitive today unless you do video encoding and stuff like that. It'll still run everything, and if you overclock it, it will still give modern CPUs a run for their money. Just their money, because you can get a Q6600 for next to nothing these days, whereas most new Intel CPUs cost an arm, a leg, and someone's spleen. Number 2. The Athlon 64 line. This series of CPUs not only was the first to implement true 64-bit architecture, the kind that actually works with 32-bit instructions too, and spearheaded the ability for all of us to have more than 4 gigs of RAM without having to keep another PC around to run older programs like some kind of console peasants. But with the Athlon 64 line, AMD also pioneered dual core for desktops. Yes, I know IBM has been demonstrating dual cores, triple cores, hexa-cores since the Ice Age probably, but they've also shown that they can build 7nm CPUs, but hey, IBM doesn't do consumer stuff, so they don't matter here. It was the Athlon 64X2 that brought true dual core to the masses. Well, to the masses that had around $500 for the standard model, and we rag about Intel's prices, but AMD sold their top-of-the-line 64-bit dual-core CPU for around $1,000. Actually, they did the same thing with the FX series on the single-core CPU side, which was also going to around $1,000. And you couldn't really say that they sort of offered gigantic advantages compared to the lower-class CPUs. For example, the 64X2 2 at its cheapest version, the $350 one, only had a 400 megahertz difference and a 512K of cache difference compared to the one that was almost $1,000. So yeah, you can probably blame AMD for milking that cow as well, and then not really doing much with the money, because things went badly with the Phenom and the next things, and then Bulldozer and then Doom. But the important thing is that the Athlon 64 series is the basis of the modern CPU we have now, and it also gave Intel that cold shot to the nuts that it needed to break the law severely on multiple occasions and to actually make better CPUs. And the number one best CPU is the MIPS R3000. Now, originally I was gonna put the RCA ComSec CDP 1802 here, but thing is that CPU wasn't really consumer oriented at all, and I wanted to keep this show focused mainly on consumer oriented CPUs. Otherwise we'd just be having a list full of whatever is in the top of the line best supercomputer now. So that's where the MIPS R3000 comes in. You may wonder, why is this here? Well, I've never heard of it. What does it do? Well, I'll tell you what it's doing now. It's orbiting Pluto. Yes, this is the CPU used in the New Horizons probe that, well, it's not actually orbiting Pluto, it's on the way to the Kuiper belt, but it gave us the best pictures of Pluto we've ever seen in our entire lives as a species up until now. And this, people, is the CPU in the PlayStation 1. No joke, it's the same CPU. Well, technically there's more than one of them on the New Horizons probe, but it's the same technology. It's the same CPU that was used to calculate Jill Valentine becoming a Jill sandwich in real time. Yes, that CPU from that console is the best CPU ever made, because let's face it, they shot it to the other side of the solar system and it still works. Now, like I said, originally I was gonna put the RCA ComSec CDP 1802 here, which is used on the Galileo and on the Voyager probes, but that's really not a commercial CPU. The MIPS R3000, however, is. The same thing you had on the PlayStation 1 recently orbited Pluto. It went past Jupiter. Meanwhile, you've probably been complaining about video games since you got the PS1 instead of doing something useful, and I hope that gives you some perspective. Well, this has been the list of the top 7 best CPUs ever made. A few special mentions are awarded to the Intel 486 processor, the original Pentiums, and to the Cell Broadband CPU. A CPU that was amazing, superb, that is still being used to calculate incredible amounts of scientific data by just chaining together some PS3s, but was a complete pain in the ass to program for. Thank you for watching this show. If you enjoyed it, please consider watching some of our other videos and maybe sharing them or giving a thumbs up if you feel like it. And if you really liked what you saw, please check out our Patreon page. For just $1 a month, you could help us make much better shows and get some rewards in the process. Or you could consider buying my book called Tale of Doom. Volume 1 is out now and available for just $2. And as always, if you thought it was horrible, you know where to find me and complain about it.